So, am I live? Okay. I'm just so deeply touched to be living what Master wanted us to live. I have to ask you all to mute your microphones so that there won't be an echo. My friend Suryani asked me to ask you.
It'll be Narayan and
Okay, there we are. Thank you very much. I first started with Master's teachings when I met Swamiji in 1969. So when we had our 50th anniversary of Ananda, I could say pretty much that I'd lived through all of it. And when we started together, it was a remote rural ashram. Swamiji always knew where we were going and was extraordinary in the way he would sensitively correct, sometimes when we had no idea that a correction was needed, but he would sensitively correct step by step to keep the flow of energy consistent with what Master's intentions were. And at the beginning, he would tell us about the future, but he commented after a while, he said he noticed that when he talked as expansively as he felt about what Master had in mind for the ray of his grace that was flowing through Swamiji. Swamiji said, instead of feeling inspired, it seemed to frighten people. So he stopped talking about it. But he would consistently, in his own spirit, and he just didn't talk about it even in private. He didn't talk about it that much. He just knew that he and we were being given an opportunity to become radiant lighthouses for Master's consciousness. Swamiji, somewhere along the line, came up with the phrase, the ray of grace that flows through this line of gurus. He was always trying to get us to understand it as a flow of divine energy rather than becoming, I want to use the word confused, by the fact that the line of gurus also had physical bodies and faces and names, in a few cases photographs, relatives, houses, sandals, pens, papers, books, all the realities that make up our lives one way or another. All of our masters also lived that life. Lahiri Mahashaya tends to be the most interesting one in a mundane way. He was a government accountant for 25 years. He got up every morning and went to the office and sat in front of ledgers. Our picture of an avatar of the great soul that is responsible for bringing Kriya into the modern age also got up in the morning, went to the office, and did account books for thousands of hours of his life. When he retired, he went and sat in what is actually the very small living room of his house. I went to India early enough to still be allowed into it. Now it's only rarely open, but a very small living room where he sat and meditated day and night, rarely leaving the room, which fits our image a little better of what an avatar is supposed to do. Sitting in silence in cosmic consciousness is more suitable. And then we have, on the other side, we have Babaji, whose life and work whose incarnation is so far away from our way of thinking, living in the Himalayas with a very advanced band of disciples, many of whom were not born in India, but born in other countries, and found their way by the grace of God to come to the Himalayas. And sometimes they walk from mountain peak to mountain peak, but sometimes by means of astral travel, the entire band just moves from mountaintop to mountaintop. Dera Danda Utau. Let us pick up our staff and walk. It became kind of a joke with Swamiji when we were going to move from place to place. Sometimes he would say, shall we, Dera Danda Utau? Shall we pick up our staff and walk? If we were even just walking from the restaurant to the nearby shop, sort of to bring Babaji to mind. Swamiji was deeply devotional, completely respectful, but also, like Master, very lighthearted and easily made humor out of that, even which was revered. There was a time when Swami was living in India. He moved there at the end of 2003. And he immediately began to film television shows. Swamiji moved to India full-time at the age of 77, when his health was less than perfect, and he was very concerned about how he would be able to travel and reach people in India. And so he was very happy to discover what hadn't been there in 1958 when he was there much earlier, with these dedicated television stations dedicated only to spiritual subjects. So Swami started filming 365 daily programs, which appeared on the television station there, and actually made Master's name known in India in a way that it hadn't been before. It was a tremendous amount of effort for Swamiji. I've written about it in the 2 books I've written about Swamiji, which may or may not be accessible yet in the languages that many of you speak. But at one point, a young man came to Swamiji, and he explained to Swamiji about an encounter he'd had when he'd been wandering in the Himalayas himself. And in that encounter, he felt that he had met Babaji, and I believe Swami thought it was true. So Babaji tells this young man that he has a message for Swami Kriyananda, which the young man came to deliver. And he said that the work that Swami Kriyananda was doing was very pleasing to Babaji. He was very pleased that Swamiji, even at that age, in his state of health, was still, with every ounce of his energy, giving himself to serving God. And then Babaji said he was especially pleased with the television programs that Swami was doing. Now, all of that is perfectly reasonable, but here's the part that I particularly wanted to point out. When Babaji said, when I heard it from Swami, that he was particularly pleased with the television programs, a part of me thought, but Babaji lives way up in the Himalayas. He doesn't have a television up there. How does he know about television? And it's very funny, isn't it? How the human mind works. Babaji is an avatar. Babaji is omnipresent. Babaji is omniscient. Anyone who says the name of Babaji with devotion attracts to himself an instant blessing. I think it's possible for Babaji to know about television, but my mind was so small with my own little preconceptions that I had relegated him to a certain sort of reality which wasn't his reality at all. It was my narrow-minded thinking. Swami Kriyananda wrote an oratorio, The Life of Jesus in Music. He wrote it about 1984. Ananda had been in existence since 1969, so it was not quite, but almost 20 years since Ananda started. From the very beginning, we would always pray as I prayed at the beginning, because it was the way Master prayed: Father, Mother, Friend, Beloved, Babaji Krishna, Jesus Christ. And on all of our altars, we would have a picture of Jesus, a painting, or more recently, another painting from the painting behind me is the one that's on most of the Ananda altars. Swami was very enamored of a painting made from the Shroud of Turin. So that picture is also widely used in Ananda. So there's always a representation of Jesus. He was always in our lineage. We always prayed to him. And even though, but there was always sort of a little bit of confusion, because either most people were raised Christian in America where we were working. I was raised Jewish, but there was a preconception about who Jesus was and what he was doing. And for some Jews, it was a reluctance to accept him. For many Christians, it was a view about who he was that was formed by the institutions of the churches. So we always celebrated Christmas, we always celebrated Easter, we prayed to Jesus. Everybody's relationship to God is entirely individual. Everybody's relationship to the masters is entirely individual. And having all the gurus that we have, for most people, for many people, Yogananda was the closest. Others came in loving Jesus and were glad to see that he was there. Many, many, many different ways. Each one of us is individually empowered by the divine, and each one of us has to follow that course of return that is given to us. And over the many years that I've been on the spiritual path, this path, I find that different ones of the saints and masters come into my awareness at different periods of time. And over the course of many years, each one of them gradually becomes more vivid. Pilgrimage to India helps, but it's not essential. I remember once I was woken up in the middle of the night because this picture of Babaji that was on a shelf just above my bed, all the masters were on a shelf above my bed. And this particular, in the middle of the night, the picture of Babaji alone fell off the shelf and landed literally right on my heart and woke me up. And I can be dense, but I got the message that maybe it's time to pay more attention to Babaji, which I turned my attention for a time. But in many ways, it wasn't until Swamiji wrote The Life of Christ in Music, and the song that Mukti sang so beautifully in 2 languages is from that oratorio, that we really began to understand, and the only word for it is the vibration of Jesus that is completely consistent with the understanding we have of his reality that was brought to us by Master. Because Master had this, and listening to Mukti sing that song, of course, I know it very well. I can sing the English words. But listening to it sung in a language that I have no familiarity with, but you could still feel the vibration which was coming through the melody. And that vibration And of course, that song was particularly chosen, Thy Light Within Us Shining. And it's the culminating song. We go through the whole life of Christ, the celebration of his birth, then, of course, the power of his mission, his redeeming souls from ignorance and suffering, and then, coming into the joy of redemption. Then, of course, there's the incredible drama, which is what we're celebrating in this season, where there's this constant struggle between Jesus and those that are empowered. We speak of the whole drama being among the Jews and the Messiah and all of that, but that was not really the struggle, because Jesus's context was, it seems, in the Essene community. And the Essene community at that time was the enduring remnant of the purity of the Jewish teaching. It was founded by an avatar, Moses. Master said that Moses was an avatar. That the true teaching of Judaism, as is still preserved by those who study the Kabbalah and others, is pure Sanatan Dharma. It's pure self-realization. The coming of the Messiah was the same tradition as the Bhagavad Gita. Whenever virtue declines and vice is in the ascendancy, I, the infinite spirit, take visible form to push back the shadow and increase the light. It's pure Sanatan Dharma. But there was a power structure, because this is what happens over the course of time. This is how Dharma gradually begins to shrink, is that individuals gain personal power, and then they begin to take that power as their own, and they want to hold on to it. I mean, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's one tiny family, where it's some little corporation, where it's you and your brothers and sisters, power comes into us. We begin to celebrate that power as our own power. We forget the source. And then when anything comes to threaten that power, we hold on to it. So what had happened, as often happens in spiritual life, is that the revelation of the avatar gradually is made into a religion by the eyes of man. And with that religion comes a Brahmin caste, however it's called, whatever it's named. At the time of Jesus, that Brahmin caste, which was the priests, had power and had money. And they had a huge temple, and they had beautiful homes. All of this is historically verified. And Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within. He said, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. He said, the purity of a man is not defined by the food that he eats or the rituals that he follows when he eats, but by the nature of his heart and every word that comes out of his mouth. He was saying that God is our Father, and that we can have a personal, intimate relationship with the divine, and that the priests are not necessary to that relationship. A religion does not become institutionalized when it becomes organized. It becomes institutionalized when the institution itself becomes the necessary intermediary between the devotee and God. And if the institution and its priest are the necessary intermediary, then that caste receives a lot of power. And they want to hold that power for themselves. They want to pass that power on to their children. And when the Messiah comes, when the avatar comes and says, it's in your hands. This is what Master brought Master brought Kriya Yoga. And what Kriya Yoga is, it returns to the individual responsibility for their relationship with God. Now, you always have the Guru. You always have the grace of God. And this is where it gets subtle. And this is why the avatars have to come back again and again to bring this to us. Now, let me find my thought here. Give me a moment. Yes. I have had the privilege, by the grace of God, of going to Israel, actually quite a few times in the last few years, maybe 4 times in the last few years. And the first time I went there, and as part of your tour, you're in Jerusalem, and you go to where the temple used to stand, because so much of the drama of the life of Jesus took place in that temple. And there's parts of this, there's parts of the original construction that are still there. None of the building, but the paving stones, the retaining wall. Those stones that are still standing after 2,000 years, they are so big, they are so heavy, they are so immovable, they are so inflexible, they are so non-responsive to suggestions about another way of being. And standing at that wall, I thought of Jesus. One man, one body, with the power of God in him, but one man, one body, going into what was a huge edifice with this powerful priesthood, and standing there and declaring a new reality. That he was eventually executed is not at all surprising. That they waited 3.5 years to do it. It's just like, of course, it was the absolute opposition of thy light within us shining and the power of the material world. That's what we were dealing with. The true light of spirit and the fixed, crushing, seemingly crushing power of the material world. I mean, one of those paving stones falling on you could snuff out your life in one breath. But the power of spirit, of course, is bigger than all of that. So when Swami, I'm going to touch the oratorio again for just a moment, when he wrote all of that music, he just taught us how to feel it from the inside. And at least for most of us, what it did is it separated the true reality of Jesus from everything else. Because he's on the line of masters. He's one of the Kriya Yoga masters. And even more powerfully, in Autobiography of a Yogi, there's a paragraph where it says, Jesus and Babaji together have planned the salvation of this age. That they're very aware of materialism, of religious bigotry, of race hatred, of narrow-mindedness, of all of the factors that characterize the world that we're living in. All of the factors that hypnotize us with their apparent power and blind us to where the true source of power is. And the extraordinarily dramatic story of the life of Jesus, every step of it. You know, the Christmas story is just all celebration. The baby is born, and of course, the baby's life was threatened immediately. And the Holy Family had to gather itself together and flee to Egypt because the apparent power, which was the king, had decreed even at that point that the baby should be killed. But the angel came and told Joseph, take the baby and his mother and flee from the jurisdiction of this evil man. Because that's the story that's always taking place. So then Jesus, first, Jesus went back to India, which, I say back to India because the three wise men, Master said, were Babaji, Lahiri, and Sri Yukteswar, coming from the high Himalayas to meet and bless the ministry of this baby at Christmas time. Then at the age of 12, Master writes this as less known, but nonetheless fact. And nowadays it's becoming just understood that during the so-called lost years of Jesus, he was in fact journeying in India, in Tibet, in Egypt. He was 18 years away from his place of birth. And during those 18 years, according to well-verified traditions now, Jesus had a huge ministry in India. I said to Swami once, sir, his ministry was more in India than it was in what we now call the Western world. And it was like, who knows, what divine mission he was carrying out there. And he instructed his apostle Thomas to go back to India. So as soon as Jesus died, Thomas went to India, landed in the south, and Christianity was established there. But what Thomas established in India was Sanatana Dharma. And it was so different than what came through Western Europe that they all actually called themselves Thomas Christians, because it was the original teaching of Jesus that held for a long time until the Portuguese came and converted it into something else. So what I'm doing with all of this is I'm laying out so that we can all really feel it, sort of what the incarnation of Jesus really was, which is strangely similar to the life that we're all living, isn't it? A community of devotees, which was the Essenes, who were holding to an ancient tradition, but brought in, active in the present, but drawing its roots from the past. It was a dedicated minority within a much larger society, and that society was sometimes hostile, but always completely out of sync with what that small community of devotees was doing. And then now Jesus also had this powerful mission, because it to confront the shadow that was being cast over the human mind at that time. Now, we're moving into a higher age. Jesus was born Kali Yuga descending, and it got much worse. It was 500 years of increasing ignorance before they reached the nadir of Kali Yuga and were be able to start up the other side. Master came to plant the seeds of what will be over time an extraordinary flowering, a restoration of the fundamental light that is shining within us. So his incarnation, Master's incarnation, even though he was persecuted and betrayed and sued in the courts, and it's the course of true love is never smooth. Nonetheless, compared to the drama of Jesus's life, it was quite different. But his life happened in Kali Yuga, which is the most materialistic age, and therefore had that form about it, where one force crashes against another force. So all through the life, the brief 3.5 years that we saw, that is the subject of what people call Christianity, Jesus was always doing this dance with the secular authority or even the religious authority and his band of disciples. He would leave Jerusalem, travel around to all the villages, calling his disciples to him. Now, many of those disciples were also part of the Essene community. This is where it all took place. Many of them were even his relatives. So there's huge pieces that you don't quite know how to put them together. You know, when Jesus reappeared and said, "Follow me," had they been waiting for him all these years? Had some of those disciples even gone to India with him? You know, there's huge pieces you don't know. But nonetheless, when Jesus came back and he was recognized, his disciples recognized him, he recognized his disciples. There's so many aspects of this story that one can just go on and on and on, especially from the perspective of who is Jesus to me? Am I hearing his call? And that call can come through Babaji or through Yogananda, through Swami Kriyananda, for others who follow this ray of grace. When those words come, follow me, what is my response? Because the whole dramatic story, which has transformed civilization and is just glorious to read and relive and to meditate on. I remember when Swamiji was talking about it once, and he called the life of Christ the greatest story ever told, which in English is a phrase that is used very, very often. And I said, meaning to be facetious, but it was a very bad joke. Just saying something like, well, that's not a very original way to describe it, Swami. I mean, I'm not sure my humor was always appropriate, but it was omnipresent. That's not a very original way to describe it. And whenever my humor was misplaced, Swami never reprimanded me, but he would reflect back to me what was appropriate. And when I said that, he looked at me, and I vividly can see his face still, because he had the eyes of a child when he said it, just wide open with wonder. And he said, "But don't you think it is?" And it was so enlightening for me to appreciate how, well, Master added a phrase to the definition of Satchitananda. And he added the modifier to the word joy. Satchitananda is ever existing, ever conscious bliss. But then Master said, ever new bliss. And that ever new can be described as childlike wonder. If you think about small children and how easily they are entranced, and how every experience is like a new experience. Sometimes it is because it's the first time. You know, people who study the development of children talk about how child's hands and feet sometimes are out of their control, and how a child's own hand will pass in front of the face and the child will be frightened because it doesn't know where it came from and it doesn't know what it is. Now, that's not ever new bliss, but what happens to us is we just, out of familiarity, we become bored. But Master wanted us to understand that the experience of the spirit it's timeless. Every time that joy of God fills us, there's no sense of, oh yes, ever new bliss again. Nothing like that. It's just always, it's always a wonder, which is why Jesus said, suffer little children to come unto me, for of such are the kingdom of heaven. He didn't mean the ignorance, the lack of self-control, the inability to express themselves. He wasn't speaking of that. He was talking about the consciousness of a child, where it's always a new, a thrilling, and a magical experience. So I was being facetious, and Swami says, don't you think the story of Jesus is the greatest story ever told? And it is, if we're able to receive it that way. It's also forever our story. There's Jesus. He has this revelation. He has a commission from his Heavenly Father, as he called him. He has a duty that he has to carry out. He's been called. Swami Kriyananda also wrote The Festival of Light, which is the story of the devotee's call and God's response. And when he's talking about the descent of the avatar, he says, a prayer of love went up from earth, and you responded. The you is with a capital Y, meaning to the divine. A prayer of love went up from earth, and you responded. A ray of light flashed out from the heart of divinity, burst downward through night skies of consciousness, and was born on earth for the redemption of mankind in human form. That's the story of Christ descending, of Master descending, of Babaji staying in his body for this whole cycle of creation, of Lahiri Mahashaya incarnating as a householder in Varanasi and going and working for 25 years in a government office before retiring to his living room to meditate and bring Kriya Yoga to the world. It's always a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. But here we are, enamored, confused, afraid. Master says in autobiography that many souls fail to make spiritual progress for lack of spiritual adventurousness. Adventurousness, you would have to say. Just for the lack of willingness. Now, really, when Jesus walked on the shore of the Lake of Galilee and saw the fishermen who were his disciples, and he said, follow me. They had homes, they had families, they had a well-established routine that they may have worked hard to create. And the voice of God says, follow me. Now, it didn't necessarily mean immediately that they would walk away from everything they were already doing. But it's the inward question. Thy light within us shining. It's the inward question. What am I following? What are my values? What do I really believe is true? What do I think is important? Where does security come from? What am I afraid of? And those are the questions. That's the path. The path is not a series of external things that we do. It's yes, for those of us who have taken Kriya, for those of us who have a meditation practice or a habit of prayer, any number of things, all of those things are also what we do. But those things are there so that our inward reality will simply become different. Over the many years that I was in close association with Swami Kriyananda. I saw him in countless ways and also saw him over a long period of time. I often say to people that I grew up at Ananda. Since children have been born and grown up there, the math doesn't quite work for me to have actually grown up at Ananda because I was 24 when I arrived. But in every way that matters, I feel that I grew up after I became a devotee, after I understood what the real purpose of life was. Prior to that, I was just marking time. And I've also been able to watch myself and others over a long period of time and really see how we can become so different. But over the course of that time, watching Swami Kriyananda, I would perceive how enlightened his response to life was. Even a very specific example that took 25 years to manifest, but was very real. I was 22 when I met Swami. I believe he was 44, 22 years older than me, and maybe 21, I think. And I was very opinionated. I was very outspoken, and I was very ignorant. But I was what Swami calls doubly ignorant, because I was ignorant of what I was ignorant of, which therefore caused me to do a lot of things that prove the great forgiving nature of Swami Kriyananda. That's all I can say. But he was always respectful, and he never once dismissed me merely because I was young and inexperienced and callow. Time passed. I become 42 and quite a bit older than that. I'm now friends with people who are 20 plus years younger than me. And not at the present time, but some years ago when I still had more external responsibilities. Strong-minded, determined 20-somethings would respond to me exactly as I responded to Swami Kriyananda. And it occurred to me how easy it would be to dismiss them just by saying the obvious, which is, I've been at this longer than you and I know. But of course I never did, because Swami never did. So later, during that time, in my 40s somewhere, I went to Swami and I said something like, "Thank you. That was really amazing. I must have tried your patience," which he did admit I did. "But you never took the cheap shot. You never referred to my age." Swami said, "Yes, I'm glad that worked." He said something, but I knew Swami well enough that I could tell I'd missed the point. And after just a moment, Swami said, in reference to the fact that I was 20 plus years younger, he said, "I never noticed." Now, he said, age, chronological age, physical age is the most trivial aspect of a person's nature. I mean, our souls are ageless. You're reincarnating from who knows how many lifetimes. So the fact that your body is 12 years old or 20 years old, it has nothing to do with who you are. Even the baby who doesn't know this is his own hand has his full consciousness present. An autobiography of a yogi master talks about being an infant in a crib and what was going on in his consciousness. And he specifically references that adults think all the baby's concerned with his toys and his toes. But Master was in the Himalayas dreaming of God, because if that's who you are, that's who you are. So coming back to Swamiji, what I realized was that he was not disciplining himself to have a good attitude. He had transformed his consciousness. And thy light within us is shining. We're here to transform our consciousness. And everything we do externally is important. It's definitely important because it will transform our consciousness. So when Jesus says, follow me, and we can't now leave our fishing boat and walk with him, to Mount Hebron or walk with him to the Jerusalem temple, but the follow me is as vivid in this moment as it was in that moment. And what we have, after that is all of this greatest story ever told, which we can live through in our hearts and imagine with our spirits and feel in our souls what kind of power is possible, what kind of courage is possible, what kind of surrender, acceptance of God's will is possible. Because Jesus said, that which I do, ye shall do, and greater things. Now, most of us in our human nature cringe a little bit. Will I be crucified? Will I be persecuted? Depends. We are moving into a higher age. It depends. Master's life was quite undramatic by comparison. We don't have to be thinking in terms of such dramatic suffering, but we do have to be thinking about the example that Jesus set and the grace that will come into us when we put our feet where he put his, and when we hear his voice and promise with whatever we can bring to that promise that I will do my best. I will do my best to follow you. So coming back, to the Easter story, those giant immovable stones. And if you read the Bible during this period of time, the confrontation between Jesus and those who held the power, the worldly power at that time, it was accelerating. Jesus goes to the home of Martha and Mary, where Lazarus, their brother, has died. Lazarus is in the tomb for 4 days. And then Jesus calls him out of the tomb. And now Jesus, and they were well known among the Jewish community there. They lived close to Jerusalem. So many, many, many people witnessed the miracle, or knew that Lazarus had died, and then Lazarus is walking around, and so the priests become more and more alarmed at what this person who calls himself Jesus, what he is doing to just disrupt the order of things. And the story of Jesus going into the temple and driving out the money changers. In the Gospels, it appears in 2 places. In one place, it happened earlier in his ministry. In the other place, it happened right at this week, right after Palm Sunday. And the money changers was this control that the priesthood had over the rituals, where in order to worship, you had to buy the right offerings. You had to take your money from wherever it was, and you had to change it into temple money. So you came with money from where you were, but that money was not acceptable in the temple. Only the temple coins were acceptable. So you had to give your foreign money to the money changers. The money changers would give you temple coins, and of course, what you would get back would be a little less than you put in, and the difference was enriching the priests. And all of the selling and buying and selling. And Jesus comes in with a whip, and he just drives this whole enterprise out of the temple. You have made of my father's house a house of merchandise and marketing. And he drove them out. And so the power structure. Now, this is personified by this corrupt priesthood, but it's us. It's us. It's within each one of us, the established order. My ego as it's always been, my little patterns and my habits and my comforts and the way I like it. When I travel, I carry my own pillow. I'm talking about myself. I carry my own pillow, and sometimes I think, will I always be able to carry my own pillow? It's a tiny thing, but mentally, thousands of things like this. This frightens me. This makes me nervous. This is what I think is true. This is who I think I am. I think I'm a female person of a certain age with a certain background and certain prejudices. I was raised Jewish. When I hear Hebrew songs, I finally found the right word for it. I bask in the familial warmth. That's a line from Autobiography of a Yogi, when he ran away with his friend to the Himalayas and they were apprehended. And Yogananda wanted to escape again and go on to their journey to the Himalayas. But his friend was now with his family again, and he was basking in the familial warmth, which is, this is comfortable to me. I'm not asking God to take it away from me. I'm not willingly renouncing it either. Master said, what God gives, we also accept with gratitude. Attachment is not to be committed to a certain way of doing things. Attachment, as Swami defined it, is the lack of flexibility and creativity to adapt to change. It's a very important thing to understand. We have to live our lives with full commitment. Some people think to be detached is to be uncommitted. That's a deep and profound misunderstanding. Lahiri Mahashaya married, raised his children, went to the office every day for 25 years, and was an exemplary employee. He was working for the Indian government for some department or another, just keeping their accounts. But it was what God gave him to do. He did it with 100% of his energy. He was completely committed. But in the moment it would be taken away from him, he would also let it go. This is not something we can pretend. This has to be our consciousness. And this is what we're trying to do, trying to transform our consciousness. So Jesus brought forward that final confrontation. And Judas was the unfortunate instrument who carried that out, who opened the doorway, but it was God's will that it should happen that way. Jesus himself said, "Save me from this hour," not because of the suffering of his own body, but because he so, with every part of him, longed to bring this ray of grace, and he saw that it was once again going to be rejected. And he saw the suffering then that people would have to go through. In Master's life, one of the sisters came and found him, and Master was weeping. And Master was weeping because he knew one of his disciples was going to stray away for a time from the spiritual path, and that he was going to suffer so much. The disciple was going to suffer. Master was weeping on his behalf. So what the masters feel is not concern for themselves. They are fearless. They're absolutely fearless. And they are completely committed without any attachment. So whatever God sends, Lord, save me from this hour, Jesus said. But then he added, for this hour was I born. I was born to carry this forward. Now, here's something I find fascinating to contemplate. Each one of us can and actually should say that. For this hour was I born. Think of how many incarnations we've lived, how many experiences we've been through, how many heartbreaks, how many triumphs, how many dramatic stories, countless incarnations. All of those incarnations have come to a focus right now. I mean, I find it incredible. You know, I live in Silicon Valley in this very pleasant little house. You know, the Apple computer company is right over there. I can go out and get coffee. I can do anything I want. For this hour was I born. Because it's all about consciousness. You know, who am I in this moment? What am I thinking about? How do I respond when whatever form it takes, Jesus says, follow me? What is my habit? Is my habit upward toward the divine, outward toward the world, downward toward contraction? And when disappointments and heartbreaks and trials and tribulations break through the little world I've constructed for myself, how do I respond? Save me from this hour. And then do I have the nerve to finish the prayer? Save me from this hour comes real. It just rolls off my tongue. That's not a problem. But the rest of it, for this hour was I born. This is my opportunity to follow. It's my opportunity to say yes. Now, here's the last little piece of it that's also exceedingly important. Jesus became the, excuse me just a moment. Jesus became the Christ. And as hard as it is to imagine, every avatar became an avatar. They became an avatar by going through all the delusions that you and I are going through. When Swamiji played the role of Jesus in a tableau for a Masonic lodge in Los Angeles, this is back in, when would that have been? 1950. Swami Kriyananda was a charismatic young man with a beard. Master had him grow a beard, and almost no one at that time in Los Angeles was wearing a beard. Somehow the picture of Jesus includes a beard. So Swami was invited to, as he said, lean against a rock and sigh heavily every now and then, pretending to be Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane for this tableau. Afterwards, Master asked him, how did it go? And I think Master said that the report that Master received was that Swami did a very good job of looking like Jesus. Swami responded, well, sir, I'd much rather be like Jesus than look like him. And Swami always tells this story very seriously because, again, that was Swami being somewhat jocular. And Master responded with complete seriousness, but very casually, oh, that will come, that will come. In other words, Kriyananda, his jiva, the name Kriyananda is temporary, the jiva, the divine spirit, the individual divine spirit that manifested as Kriyananda, Master was saying, will become the Christ. because all of us will become the Christ. And to Master, it was so self-evident and natural that he was going to become the Christ that he didn't even feel the necessity to say it more than just like, it's a sunny day. It's a sunny day and you will become a Christ. Now, one of the reasons that Master could say that, one of the reasons that Jesus could say, that which I do, ye shall do, and greater things, was because he could look at every one of his disciples and Jesus could see himself. And I don't mean he could see his divinity. He could see the consciousness that we have now and know that it was just a temporary stage and it would end in God realization. In other words, the masters have walked through all the stages of delusion there are to walk through, and they all know that we'll all get through all of them and get free. And the contemplation of this, for me at least, how do I want to say it? It has created an intimacy in my relationship with the masters, because I don't feel separate from them. I feel separate from their realization. There's no question about that. But they did it. They stood here. I don't have to be ashamed. I don't have to be discouraged. They did it. And they'll take me through. The reason they came is to take me through, to take you through, to take each one of us through. Ours is also the most dramatic story ever told. Whether it gets written up and remembered doesn't matter. But the same power that caused Jesus to face into, and of course, so much of the symbolism of Christianity has been Jesus on the cross. But that was actually a rather random choice. It could just as easily have been Jesus rising from the tomb. So the resurrection of Jesus is actually the story. The crucifixion also is necessary because all of us experience that. Every one of us is given as much of a challenge as will help us to grow beyond who we are at this point. So we're all, the actual only word for it is crucified. It's a rather dramatic word, for not having any milk for our tea or whatever it is that's bothering us today. But whatever it is pushes us to have to say, even now, Lord, when you call me, I will follow. Because the end of the story is standing free, in which all the rest of it didn't matter. I have come to understand very deeply that if there was another route to my eternal freedom in God, if there was an easier path that Divine Mother could lead me down, she would lead me down it. Why wouldn't she? So if the only way to get from here to there is by this route, that's because it's the shortest, the fastest, and the best. For this hour was I born. And Jesus, from his resurrection, from the bliss of that freedom, he's just always saying, follow me, follow me. But sir, a lot of bad things happened on your route. That's all right, come, you'll see. Because on the other side of it is everything that we're seeking. Thy light is always shining within us. And now we can live it. Live it now, live it in tomorrow, live it for eternity. So that's what I have to say right now, but do you have questions or thoughts or comments that we should now talk about?
My question is, for those not in tune with it, 2,000 something years ago, Jesus must have seen such a political revolution. Given the state of the world right now, filled with divisiveness and anger, how would you counsel or relate to our brothers and sisters who are seeking freedom through a political revolution? And also, what is the most elevated service for those of us on the spiritual path to do to serve them? That's it.
Okay. Is it possible, Suryani's asking me if Mukti can mute herself? Because we're getting an echo from her. Okay, thank you. I think that this whole thing is a technical marvel, so I understand. We're just working it through and it comes out. Jagadish, that is a really good question you've asked, and it's a question that I've thought about a great deal. I'm going to condense my answer a little bit because I could talk about it for a long time, but let's start with. Master often said that the transition between yugas is often tempestuous, very rocky, very divisive. When the last time it was Kali Yuga and Dwapara Yuga meeting was when we were in the descending cycle of the yugas. For those of you, forgive me if you're not completely familiar, but this is the rising and falling consciousness on planet Earth as the Earth itself moves closer and farther away from the center of the galaxy. Master speaks of it, Sri Yukteswar speaks of it in the Holy Science. When it was the descending cycle, Dwapara going into Kali, that was Krishna's incarnation, and that was the Mahabharata war, the Battle of Kurukshetra, in which civilizations and ways of being were totally wiped out. We're now Kali Yuga again, meeting Dwapara, but we're rising. So instead of consciousness on the planet will gradually raise, but slowly, not transformed in our lifetimes. And the conflict between the age of matter meeting the age of energy is dramatic, and it's going to get worse. Master said it's going to get worse. And much of what Kali Yuga has stood for is being demolished by the rising age of energy. But souls incarnate to have these experiences. And so there are many souls who have incarnated in this planet who are here to resist the expanding consciousness and to create and to have the opportunity to do evil things, because much is going to be destroyed. And so the souls that need to have the experience of destroying things have incarnated with us. We have incarnated to be the instruments that are bringing in the light. They have incarnated to be the instruments who get to spread darkness at this period of time. Everybody is equally loved by God, and everybody is getting to act out their karma, but each of us has to act according to the destiny and the responsibility we've been given. I have not been given any responsibility for running the country, for setting up new systems of welfare, none of that. That's just not my job. The understanding I've been given is that consciousness is the key. And when I first went to India in 1986, India was really just at the beginning of what we've seen now. It was the first time I'd been into what, I don't know what the proper words are, I would call it then a developing country. I looked out the window at all the people from the comfortable air-conditioned bus at 4 in the morning in the city of Delhi, realizing that those were all people sleeping on the sidewalk. I was from California, I'd never seen it. But I knew in that moment, we have all the technology and all the money in the world to make this heaven on earth. The reason we don't is because we don't want to. And the reason people don't want to is because they have low consciousness. The entire issue is consciousness. It's not political systems. I mean, it's not climate change, any of those things. All of those things would not be a problem if we had the right consciousness. And I realized I was already doing what I'm still doing. I consider myself the most politically active person I know. I have spent my entire adult life trying to inspire and guide people to change their consciousness. Because once we change our consciousness, everything else will work. And unless we change our consciousness, nothing will work. You can take the best system in the world and ruin it if you don't have expanded consciousness. So, now that's part of it. And that's why I said there's a lot to say to this. Here's another part of it. Master predicted that there would be armed conflict, there would be war, there would be what we're seeing of race hatred and religious bigotry and corrupt leadership and callous leadership all over the place. It will keep happening, but it will gradually evolve, Master said, into something that even in the world looks more like light and darkness battling in an external way. That's what happened in Krishna's incarnation. Krishna and the Pandavas were really fighting, and that's history. It's not just allegory. They were really fighting a selfish regime, and they went to war. And Krishna had to persuade Arjuna to pick up his bow and arrow, to pick up his weapon and fight, literally, externally fight. I mean, that's about as real world as it gets. However, and this was a conversation between Swami Kriyananda and another Indian teacher, before there is a confrontation between light and dark, darkness is fighting with itself. Now, when I look at the political world and all that's going on, I have a hard time finding any pure heroes. It's not that they don't exist. It's not that we haven't had them in history. But when I look at the fight that's going on in society, I don't know where to stand. Some sides are clearly, to my mind, darker than others. But even the good guys, their consciousness is not necessarily that inspiring to me. One of the things that was said by Swami at that time is that darkness will fight with itself until it becomes weak enough for the final confrontation. Not final, because this isn't Armageddon, but for the political shift that Master predicted, where there really will be a righteous side in this. My point of view and my personal decision is, right now, there's nothing I can do. I can't, in good conscience, give my heart to anything much that I see outside of me. So I'm just going to keep working on consciousness, because that's really my job. That's really where the shift will come. Now, I can imagine a time when the moral issues in the world around me have become so intensified that I will have to participate. Partly because of my Jewish heritage, also because it's so dramatic. I call it the rescuing the babies from the Warsaw Ghetto moment. when humanity transcends all other considerations and action must be taken. So I pay attention. I personally am not there yet, but I can imagine being there. In the meantime, I'll serve anybody that I can serve who wants what I actually have to give. Attunement with God, self-transformation, meditation, belief and understanding of the yugas, understanding of the guru-disciple relationship, reincarnation, all of these things. That's what I have to give. Now, I'm speaking for myself. I'll share that with anyone. But when I'm with someone who isn't interested, I only have so many minutes in a day and so many years in an incarnation. I have to do that which I am capable and commissioned to do. My life is very simple. Many other of your lives are more complicated. I say simple. The circumstances of my life are very narrow. My choices are not many. I have no family. I have no children. I just don't have anything to do. I can specialize. For many of you, even that specialization may be more diffuse. You have to make your living teaching yoga. You can't be quite so narrow in what you offer, but you can still be loyal to what you know is really important. Now, all of this is very individual. Swamiji's answer, I can go on this, but I want to have space for another question. Swamiji's answer is whatever you choose to do it in attunement with God with as much energy and creativity as you can bring to it. And he would say, if you feel called to go out in the streets and demonstrate, if you want to start a political party, if you want to run for office, do it as well and as beautifully as you can. Because everything is an opportunity for expanding consciousness. But don't be afraid to say, this is what I am called to do. And to believe that that's beneficial. So that's enough, although I could say more. Another question?
Thank you, by the way. If there is no other questions, I could hear you more. Oh, so clear, my friend. Thank you. And blessings to you and all that you are doing. You have provided such a inspiring example of how to be a channel for the teaching. So God bless you. Thank you.
It's very kind of you. All credit elsewhere. I understand, and I have to acknowledge it. The worlds that many of you live in, politically speaking. America, we're so innocent and so sort of childlike in our expectations. We've had we're in a big shift. Many of you all have had to live with far more challenging circumstances than I can even imagine. So I don't want to be glib about my solutions, which are extraordinarily influenced by my culture. So I understand these are very big questions for many of you, and many of you are standing at very different fulcrum points than I'm standing at now. Oh, hello, Mila.
I would like to ask you about what Swamiji thought about intentional communities for these times, especially how he told about community as a solution for these specific times.
There's no question that an enormous amount of the difficulty we face in the world would be solved by communities. It's also true that communities are very difficult to start. And even in the US, where the founding community of Ananda is 50 years old, we still have just a tiny handful. And even that handful is not clear cut. So I'm not meaning to be discouraged. I'm trying to be realistic. So we have to build step by step as well as we can. And community is people. And yes, it's greatly helped if we can physically live near each other, if we can work together. I mean, all of the things that we all know, meditate and so on. But it's all people. So the way to build community is to build friendship, to build trust, to build shared experiences, to behave with mutual respect. And beyond that, we have to do our best knowing that God is in charge of this. Master said it will be the social pattern of the future, that this ideal will spread like wildfire. Swami Kriyananda said, history will show that the most important thing going on in the world right now is Ananda and the communities that we have. But we don't seem to be there yet. So it's important, but it's important for a single reason. It helps people spiritually. That's why it's important. So it's not like we're trying to build communities. We're trying to help people spiritually. So the way Swamiji taught us to develop was to follow opportunities as they came to us. If those opportunities were in harmony with the ray of grace that we're trying to express, and we follow those opportunities, but we also have to be, in his words, practical in our idealism. And the mere fact that we know it's a good idea and that we know it will work and that we know it will be good for people doesn't always mean that it happens in the way that we think. So my way of thinking about this, and many things that Swami tried did not work. Many things that I have tried have not worked. But everything that does work or doesn't work, I try to create the right vibration of consciousness. I mean, this is Easter. We're talking about Jesus. By any measure, Jesus' life, except for those who believe he was resurrected, but from any worldly point of view, it was a catastrophe. And I believe all his disciples, except for John, had martyr's death. Thomas in India, even in India, Thomas was martyred. He was stabbed with a spear or betrayed by somebody he was trying to help. I mean, these are not successful endings. But they were absolutely loyal in their consciousness to what they were trying to do. And that's where the power came from. So I feel like what I'm doing is I'm setting a vibrational pattern that will eventually be added to all the other vibrational patterns. And the success of my own endeavors, I may never live to see a lot of it. But when it finally manifests, as Master said, when these catastrophic times are finished, it will be the power that we generated by our sincere effort to do the right thing according to our ray of grace, which includes as much as we can. Let's create as much community as we can, as many, grounded, tangible, living communities as we possibly can. But the power of that is the power of our friendship and our love and our consciousness. So the only way to get to that is, yes, to get the land and get the apartment and get the house, if we can. But the only way to bring that about is by having the right consciousness. Love, friendship, devotion, determination, courage. But then it has to be nishkam karma. We're absolutely committed, but thy will be done. I hope that helps.
We have a question from here in Serbia.
Okay.
What is the best way to start Ananda Living Wisdom School if we don't have a community, only a city center?
how to start Ananda Living Wisdom Schools. Well, we started one, so I know how it's done. It takes a lot of energy. Master tried to start a school when he got Mount Washington. The first thing he did there would have a school for children. And then he said he realized that he had to convert the parents before they would believe in what he was doing for their children. We started our school with one absolutely gifted teacher. You have to have someone who can actually take care of children. It's not theoretical. The gift of being able to actually guide children is a special dispensation from the divine. And we have to be able to actually take care of children. Ananda Living Wisdom Education for Life schools were started really by Nitai, one person who got, I think, 6 or 7 children together in what had been a chicken coop. And he just started guiding and inspiring them, learning as he was going, giving the children what they really wanted. Nowadays, like everything else, education is very complicated. Depending on the country you live in, and I'm not familiar with what you all are dealing with in terms of education, parents are naturally very protective of their children, and it's very unusual parents who are willing to experiment with their children. We did not. Our school was the school at the village was built with the children of the residents. Our school was not, and still isn't, it was not built by the children of the residents, although we did have the very, very first classes were, I'm trying to think here, many of the people were also involved with us, but some of them were just complete outsiders who were just inspired by the teacher we had and inspired by the vision that we had. But I remember having to try to persuade parents to send their children to a school that didn't exist unless they sent their children to it. And I naturally saw a certain reluctance in the eyes of some of those parents because they only had these children. They didn't want to risk them. I think on a practical level, if you start young, you do better. Because parents sort of, what they'll do for 4 and 5-year-olds, they weren't always do for 9 and 10-year-olds. But I'm actually talking through my hat about that. I think it's a real challenge. And you have to be guided by God. And there are many, many people who are much more experienced than I in what you're trying to do. And I think you should look to them for help. I think you have to take advantage. Let me think how to say this. You have to be practical in your idealism. You have to gauge for yourself how much time, how much energy you have to give to this, how much time you have to give it, how many other calls you have upon your energy, how profoundly you feel, compelled by God to do your best to carry this out. And then you just have to take it step by step. And I don't think there's a formula per se. It's just, what are the opportunities in front of me? And how can I move into them with the best possible energy? I think that's really all I can sincerely say on that point. I'm not trying to be discouraging. I just know that it's a big job. But let's do our best. And let's count success. Let's count success by the consciousness and the good that we're willing to do. When I took on the responsibility more than 30 years ago to help develop what we have now in this area, I defined my job in a really simple way. My job was to be helpful to people and to inspire people with what I had to give and to just create inspiring moments, just one at a time. And if every little thing we did was uplifting and beneficial. I didn't keep score. And I wasn't always measuring, are we succeeding? Are we not succeeding? If we're being instruments of light, we're being beneficial to the people that we come in contact with. We're doing our best to respond to opportunities as they're presented to us. The rest of it is in God's hands. I'll do my little bit, but the real story, it's really in His hands. Yeah.
Yes. I have a question from one of our sister. Question is the spiritual path toward Christ consciousness. Is it universal or not? And or there is, how many people saw many ways to this Christ consciousness? Is it clear?
It's clear. There's a Sanskrit word that I recently learned called sampradaya. Sampradaya means lineage. And the path to self-realization, Christ consciousness, whatever you want to call it, it is the ocean toward which every drop of water on the earth is flowing. Every jiva, every one of us, as individual expressions of the divine, are called, compelled by our own nature to seek that ocean of divinity. We may form a little puddle and sit by the side of the road for a while. We may take a whirlpool. We may, go underground. But we are compelled to move toward that ocean. And more than that, even, the nature of creation is that sooner or later we will come to that realization for a very simple reason. The nature of the jiva, the nature of every sentient being, is to try to avoid suffering and try to experience whatever we define as happiness. And if you look at yourself, at everything you do, whether it proves to have been wise or profoundly misguided, every decision we make is because we imagine it will help us to avoid suffering and to experience more of what we call happiness. Even if we become a drug addict, an alcoholic, an ice cream addict, a mean, terrible person who drives everyone away from us, somewhere we thought we would suffer less and have more happiness by doing it. So what happens is, over many incarnations, we experiment. And you can certainly look at your life and see things you used to do because you thought they made you happy, that you gradually figured out were not taking you where you wanted to go. So we change. Anybody who's overcome an addiction can really speak to that. Okay? Over many, many lifetimes, we keep having experiences. That's what karma is. Karma is unlearned lessons. The Bible calls it sin, but it's ignorance is what it is. I think this is going to reduce my suffering and make me happy, but in fact, it increases my suffering and makes me less happy. So karma is all those misunderstandings, and the nature of creation is that we get to keep having those experiences, which means sooner or later we figure it out. Which, when I say Jesus stood where I'm standing vibrationally, he at one point was making the same decisions I was making, thinking they would reduce my suffering and bring me happiness, but those are not my best decisions because they don't, I'm not yet at God realization, but I will be. It will come because my own experience will teach me. Christ consciousness is infinite awareness. Our own lives are just a gradual expansion of awareness. And what the masters tell us is that awareness can increase to infinity. But if you look at your life, a very interesting way to look at your life, besides suffering and happiness, is everything we learn is because we became aware of something that we didn't know before. I thought this was a good idea, but I became aware of the fact that it wasn't. The baby is afraid of his own hand, but he gradually becomes aware of the fact that it's my own hand. Everything is a gradual increase of awareness. And you can just ask the question, is there any end to awareness? The expansion of awareness? Or am I going to learn something today that I wasn't aware of yesterday? And where would that stop? So this is one sampradaya, which is a word that's hard to say, but I like it. Jesus is a lineage. Yogananda is a lineage. Buddha is a lineage. But they're all taking us step by step to learn about suffering and happiness, to increase our awareness until our awareness becomes infinite. So we're all in the same boat, whatever color we paint it, whatever we may look like. We're all just little drops, compelled by our own nature to seek the sea. That's the extraordinary, expansive, thrilling beauty of the whole story. Isn't it a wonderful story? Isn't it one of the most dramatic stories ever told? My drama, your drama, for this hour were we born.
Can I have just one last quick question?
Okay.
You just mentioned this word sampradaya, lineage, and you mentioned that Jesus is, let's say, one sampradaya and Yogananda is another. Let's say. Can you explain? Because there are some new people in our group. So how do they overlap or how do they merge?
That was actually, yeah. It was, as I said that, I realized that was a bad example because Jesus and Yogananda are one lineage, but there's, let me pull this together for a moment. Master talked always about a line of gurus that has existed for a very long time, which we always name going back to Krishna and including Jesus. And it's a line of masters and disciples moving through a long period of time that have had a recent incarnation in the presence of Yogananda. But by no means is this the only line of avatars in creation. How many, who, what, how it works is really beyond me. But every true path is going by a different route to the same goal. Here, this is what I'll say. So let me put it this way. Every path has its outward expression and its inner reality. In the outward expression, they vary quite a lot. You know, the Zen Buddhists behave quite differently than we as self-realizationists do. The Kabbalists that we met in Sfat in Israel have a whole totally different kind of practice than our practice, and that outwardly. But inwardly, the effect of our practices is all identical because compassion, kindness, calmness, a clearer understanding of what causes suffering and what brings happiness, confidence in the will of God, a shift in our actual perception of reality. The result of all these seemingly different is that we transform because we're all made the same. We all have chakras, we all have kundalini, but different. Look how different we all are. I mean, we can't even speak the same language, some of us. Look, every one of our faces is recognizable. Each one of us has a completely different story that we're telling. So all of this unique individuality means that we have affinities in different directions. Some are more drawn to a sort of austere path, some want a very musical, bouncy path. Some people are totally devoted to service, others are alone in a cave. But each one of us is doing that which is going to change our inner consciousness. And so God, in his great wisdom, Divine Mother in her great mercy, sends us all these different lineages so that we can find the one that matches us. And then we can find the kindred spirits who experience life more like we experience, so our families, our spiritual families can form. It's all quite amazing, really. When Master had an extended experience of cosmic consciousness in 1948, and for 3 days he was in this totally altered state, and his disciples sat in teams, taking turns, writing down the things that Master was saying, because he was having all these conversations with Divine Mother. I mean, all of this is just like mysterious to me, but marvelous to contemplate. Divine Mother took him around the universe, and I'm just repeating, I don't even know what this means, took him around the universe, and he said, "Oh, that's how you do it, Mother." What on earth was he seeing? But he was saying, "Oh, that's how you do it." So all of this, that's how she does it. She just makes us all unique and then sends someone to us who's going to help us along our way because she loves us all equally. She's just as happy when the murderer spares one member of the family. God loves that murderer just as much as he loves any saint in the world. Each of us by our own, but the murderer will suffer. The fact that God loves the murderer doesn't mean that the murderer's terrible choice won't bring him tremendous suffering. But Divine Mother's just there, waiting. You know, no devotee is ever lost. We're all equally loved by God. We will all equally be drawn home to the divine.
We will thank you again, Asha, for this lovely evening in our part of the world. We hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you very much.
And we wish all our brothers and sisters in Romania, in Russia, in Bulgaria, a very happy and blessed Easter tomorrow.